Close your eyes for a moment and picture a medieval meal. What do you see? Perhaps you imagine a giant roasted turkey leg held in a greasy hand, or a silver goblet overflowing with wine. Or maybe a long wooden table groaning under the weight of wild boar, venison, and exotic fruits. Now erase that image. Wipe it completely from your mind. That is the fantasy. That is the Hollywood version of history designed to look good on camera. The reality of what a medieval peasant actually put in their mouth is far stranger, far darker, and surprisingly, far more complex than any movie has ever shown you. We are talking about a world where bread could be used as a plate, where vegetables were often considered peasant food, unfit for the nobility, and where a single bad harvest could turn an entire village into a graveyard within months. But the biggest lie you have been told is about the meat. You have probably heard the stories that medieval people ate rotten meat covered in expensive spices to hide the smell. We are going to debunk that myth once and for all, because it makes absolutely no economic or logical sense. But before we get to the meat, we have to start with the foundation. We have to start with the one thing that stood between a peasant and death. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we are embarking on a massive journey, a deep dive into the everyday lives of our ancestors to answer a simple but vital question. How did they actually survive? We have a lot to cover in this series, from the truth about perpetual stews to the nightmare of hallucinogenic bread that caused mass hysteria. So, before we sit down at this humble table, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm share these history mysteries with more people. And if you enjoy deep dives into the dark, gritty corners of history, make sure you are subscribed and have that notification bell turned on. You do not want to miss what we are serving up next. Are you ready? Let's turn back the clock 600 years. Let's dig in. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, whether you were trudging through the mud of England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, your life revolved around one thing. Not God, not the king, but grain. Grain was not just food, it was the currency of survival. Historians estimate that for the average peasant, roughly 70 to 80% of their daily caloric intake came from grain. 80%. Imagine that for a second. Imagine if nearly everything you ate today, every meal, every snack, was just bread, oatmeal, or porridge. But here is where the first misconception lies. We tend to think of bread as the soft, white, fluffy slices you buy at the supermarket in a plastic bag that stays fresh for a week. That is not what a medieval peasant was eating. In fact, if a peasant was caught eating white, refined wheat bread, they could be looked upon with suspicion or even scorn. In the Middle Ages, bread was a hierarchy baked into a loaf. It was a physical manifestation of your place in society. At the very top, you had manchet. This was the bread of the aristocracy. It was made from wheat that had been sifted and sifted again through fine cloths to remove all the bran and the germ, leaving only the finest, purest white flour. It was soft, it was light, and it was incredibly expensive. It represented purity, wealth, and status. It was the wonder bread of the elite. But you, the peasant working the fields from sunrise to sunset, you are not eating manchet. You were likely eating maslin. Maslin bread was a mixture. It was typically a blend of wheat and rye grown together in the same field. It was darker, denser, and significantly heavier than the bread of the rich. But honestly, it was probably healthier. It was full of fiber and slow-burning energy that a laborer needed to survive the grueling physical demands of feudal life. And if you were truly poor, if the harvest had been bad, or if you were at the bottom of the peasant hierarchy, you were eating bread made from barley, oats, or even legumes like dried peas and beans ground into a coarse flour. This bread was heavy like a brick. It was dark brown or gray, and it was tough. We aren't talking about a chewy crust like a modern artisan sourdough. We are talking about bread that could literally break your teeth. And this brings us to a painful reality of medieval dining. The technology of the time was simple. Grain was ground into flour using massive stone mills. As these heavy stones ground against each other day after day, they would slowly erode. Tiny, microscopic fragments of stone, grit, and sand would mix into the flour. There was no way to sift it all out. So, every time a peasant bit into a loaf of bread, they were essentially chewing on sandpaper. Over a lifetime, this grit would grind their teeth down flat. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletons often shows severe tooth wear, with the enamel completely worn away, exposing the sensitive pulp and nerves underneath. Eating could be a painful experience, a daily reminder of the harshness of life. This obsession with grain went even deeper than just nutrition. Bread wasn't just part of the meal, it was the meal. And it was also the tableware. In a time before ceramic plates were cheap and widespread, and centuries before anyone used a fork, medieval people used trenchers. A trencher was a thick, stale slab of bread, usually cut from a loaf that was a few days old. It was used as a plate. You would ladle your thick vegetable stew, or place your piece of meat directly onto this stale bread. As you ate, the juices, the grease, and the sauce would soak into the trencher, softening it and flavoring it. Now, think about the practicality of this. It is genius. No dishes to wash. But there was a social rule attached to this edible plate. If you were a guest at a wealthy banquet, you did not eat your trencher. Eating your plate was considered rude. It showed you were starving and lacked manners. After the meal, these juice-soaked slabs of bread were collected and given to the poor as alms, or thrown to the dogs. But for you, the peasant family eating in your small, smoke-filled cottage, you absolutely ate the trencher. That soaked-up gravy was the best part of the meal. It was flavor, and it was calories. In a world of scarcity, you wasted nothing. But how did you get this bread? This leads us to another dark reality of the era, one that explains why peasants were often so angry. You couldn't just bake bread whenever you wanted. In many feudal systems, you couldn't even own an oven. The lord of the manor owned the oven, just like he owned the land, the mill, and the press for making cider. Peasants were often required to pay a fee to use the lord's oven to bake their dough. These fees were called banalities. It was a system designed to extract every penny, or rather, every grain, from the labor of the poor. If you were caught baking bread in your own home to avoid the fee, you could be fined heavily or punished. It was a monopoly on hunger. The Lord controlled the means of production and the means of preparation. Because bread was life, the person who made the bread held immense power. And with power comes corruption. Medieval bakers were some of the most regulated and watched people in society. They were the subjects of intense scrutiny and often intense hatred. Why? Because it was so easy to cheat. Imagine you are a baker in 14th century London. The price of firewood has gone up. Flour is expensive. So maybe you mix in a little chalk to make the flour look whiter. Maybe a little sawdust to add bulk. Maybe you make the loaf just a tiny bit smaller, hoping no one notices in the rush of the morning market. This wasn't just a minor scam. This was playing with people's lives. A slightly smaller loaf meant a family went hungry. Adulterated flour could make a whole village sick. To combat this, authorities introduced strict laws, most famously the assize of bread and ale in England. This law linked the price of bread to the price of wheat. It set strict standards for weight and quality. If a baker was caught cheating, if they were caught selling a loaf that was too light or filled with garbage, the punishment was public and humiliating. They might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden sled, with the offending loaf of bread tied around their neck for everyone to see. They could be locked in the pillory, where angry customers could throw rotten vegetables, mud, or worse at them. It was a clear message from the authorities: do not mess with the people's food. This strict regulation is actually where we get the term a baker's dozen, meaning 13. Bakers were so terrified of accidentally shortchanging a customer and being whipped in the public square that they would often throw in an extra 13th loaf when selling a dozen, just to be absolutely sure the total weight was above the legal limit. It was a bonus born out of fear. So, we have established that your stomach is full of heavy, gritty, dark bread. You have consumed perhaps 2 to 3 pounds of it today. That is a lot of dry matter. You are thirsty. The smoke from the open fire in your cottage is drying out your throat. You look at the river running through your village. It looks clear enough, but you saw your neighbor dumping chamber pot waste into it upstream this morning. You saw a dead sheep floating in it yesterday. Do you drink the water? If you listen to common myths on the internet, you might think the answer is a hard no. You might think, medieval people never drank water because it was dirty. They only drank alcohol. Well, that is partially true, but also a massive oversimplification that misses the fascinating science of medieval survival. Water was drunk, but it was a gamble. The real fuel of the medieval peasant, the liquid gold that kept the workforce moving, was ale. But not the beer you know today. We are not talking about a cold, carbonated lager. We are talking about a thick, nutritious, cloudy, soup-like drink that even children consumed for breakfast. Why was everyone, from toddlers to grandparents, slightly buzzed all the time? Or were they? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the liquid diet. We will discover why monks were the best brewers in Europe, what small beer actually was, and why you might start your day with a drink that would get you fired from your job in the 21st century. But most importantly, we will answer the question: did they really drink beer because they knew the water would kill them? The answer is more surprising than you think. You don't want to miss that. So, you are standing there in your mud-floored cottage, holding a wooden cup. You are thirsty. The river outside is running past your door, but you hesitate. You have heard the stories, or perhaps, in your modern mind, you have read the history books that tell you the water in the Middle Ages was poison. You have been told that everyone, from kings to paupers, walked around in a constant state of drunkenness because alcohol was the only safe thing to drink. Let's stop right there. This is one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages, and like most myths, it is a half-truth that hides a much more interesting reality. Did medieval people drink water? Of course they did. If you were working in a field on a hot July day, you weren't going to wait until you got home to crack open a cask of ale. You drank from the stream. Doctors of the time even recommended water for its cooling properties. But, and this is a massive but, they were not stupid. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They had never seen a microbe. But they had eyes and noses. They knew that water from a stagnant pond, or water downstream from a tannery where they treated leather with urine, tasted foul and made you sick. They knew that clear, running water was better. But in a world without plumbing, without chlorine, and without filters, water was always a gamble. It offered hydration, yes, but it offered 0 calories. And when you are burning 4,000 calories a day doing back-breaking manual labor, water is just not enough. You need fuel. This is where ale enters the picture. And notice I am saying ale, not beer. In the early and high Middle Ages, there was a crucial difference. Beer, as we know it today, relies on hops, those little green flowers that give beer its bitterness and act as a preservative. But hops didn't become widespread in England until the 15th century. Before that, you had ale. Medieval ale was a completely different beast. It was brewed using malted barley, water, and yeast, but instead of hops, it was flavored with a mixture of herbs and spices known as gruel. This could include things like bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, or even rosemary. The result was a drink that was sweeter, thicker, and far more cloudy than modern beer. It wasn't transparent. If you held it up to the light, you wouldn't see through it. It was full of suspended proteins and carbohydrates. In many ways, ale wasn't just a drink. It was liquid bread. It was food. A pint of thick medieval ale could provide a significant chunk of your daily nutritional needs. It contained B vitamins from the yeast and calories from the grain. For a peasant on the edge of starvation, alcohol wasn't a vice, it was a survival strategy. But here is the brilliance of it, a scientific accident that saved millions of lives. The brewing process requires boiling the water. The medieval peasant didn't know why this worked. They just knew that if you drank the water from the well, you might spend the next 3 days dying of dysentery. But if you drank the ale made from that same water, you felt fine. The boiling killed the pathogens. The alcohol prevented new bacteria from growing. It was the safest hydration technology they had. This safety was so critical that ale was consumed by everyone. And I mean everyone. This brings us to the concept of small beer. If you walked into a medieval household at breakfast time, you wouldn't see coffee or orange juice. You would see the whole family drinking ale. But they weren't getting hammered at 6 a.m. They were drinking small beer. This was the result of the second or third running of the mash. When you make ale, you soak the grain in hot water to extract the sugars. The first soak gets all the sugar. That makes the strong ale, the stuff that gets you drunk. But grain is expensive, and you don't waste anything. So you add more water to the leftover grain and soak it again. This second batch has very little sugar, which means very little alcohol. Perhaps only 1% or less. This was small beer. It was safe to drink because it had been boiled, but it wasn't strong enough to intoxicate you. It was essentially a lightly fermented, grain-flavored energy drink. It was given to children, pregnant women, and workers. It was the Gatorade of the Middle Ages. It kept you hydrated without dulling your senses while you wielded a scythe or an axe. Who was making all this ale? Today we think of brewing as an industry dominated by massive factories. Back then, it was domestic work. It was women's work. The person brewing the ale was almost always the woman of the house, known as the alewife or brewster. Just as she baked the bread and spun the wool, the peasant woman brewed the ale. It was a domestic art, passed down from mother to daughter. And if a woman was particularly good at it, if her ale was consistently tasty and didn't go sour, she might brew a little extra. She would put a sign outside her door, often just a broomstick or a bundle of foliage known as an ale stake, to let the neighbors know she had fresh ale for sale. This was the birth of the public house, or the pub. But there was another group of brewers who operated on a completely different scale: the monks. While peasant women were brewing in cauldrons over open fires, monasteries were building industrial-scale breweries. For monks, ale was essential. They lived by strict rules, often fasting for long periods where they couldn't eat solid food. But the church rules said, "Liquidum non frangit iunium." Liquid does not break the fast. So they brewed. They brewed heavy, rich, caloric doppelbocks and ales that could sustain a man who wasn't eating anything else. They had the best equipment, the cleanest water sources, and they were the only ones who could write down their recipes and refine them over centuries. If you wanted the best drink in the Middle Ages, you didn't go to a tavern. You went to a monastery. However, relying on ale had its downsides. It spoiled very quickly. Without hops to preserve it, medieval ale would turn sour in a matter of days. This meant you couldn't transport it very far. You had to drink it local, and you had to drink it fresh. It created a hyper-local food culture where every village had its own distinct flavor, depending on the local water and the local herbs used in the gruel. But what if you didn't live in an area where grain grew well? What if you lived in the apple orchards of the West Country? Then you drank cider. Or if you were lucky enough to have access to honey, you might drink mead. But mead was expensive. Honey was the only sweetener available in Europe before sugar became widespread, so fermenting it into alcohol was a luxury. It was the drink of weddings and feasts, not the drink of the harvest field. So, picture your peasant again. He has eaten his dense rye bread. He has washed it down with a quart of cloudy small beer. He has consumed perhaps 3,000 calories, but almost all of it is carbohydrates. He is fueled, but he is lacking something crucial: protein, fat, muscle. He looks at the forest bordering his field. He knows there are deer in there. He knows there are wild boars. He knows that a single roasted rabbit could provide the nourishment his family is desperate for. But he also knows that the forest belongs to the Lord. To hunt there is a crime. To kill a deer is poaching, and the punishment can be blinding, mutilation, or hanging. And yet, we are told that medieval peasants ate terrible meat. We are told they ate meat that was rotting off the bone, masked with pepper and cinnamon. Why would a peasant who risks his life to catch a fresh rabbit let it rot? And how could he afford spices that cost more than his entire house to cover up the smell? The truth about the medieval meat consumption is not just about what they ate. It is about class, law, and the struggle to get protein in a world that wanted to keep you weak. In the next part, we are going to butcher the biggest myth of them all. We are going to find out why rotten meat is a lie, and uncover the ingenious, sometimes illegal ways peasants put meat on the table. Step into the smokehouse. It's time to talk about the flesh. Now we arrive at the most pervasive, disgusting, and completely illogical myth concerning the Middle Ages. It is a story repeated in bad history textbooks, tourist dungeons, and Hollywood movies for decades. The story goes like this. Medieval people had no refrigeration. Therefore, their meat was constantly rotting. To make this putrid, gray, maggot-ridden flesh edible, they smothered it in heavy spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg to hide the smell and the taste of decay. Let's look at this idea with the eyes of an economist and a chef. It is preposterous. It is the historical equivalent of suggesting that someone today would buy a molding, expired fast food burger and then cover it in shaved truffles and gold leaf to make it palatable. In the Middle Ages, spices were not groceries. They were treasures. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron had to be transported thousands of miles from Asia, overland via the Silk Road, or by sea through dangerous waters, passing through countless middlemen, tax collectors, and merchants before arriving in a European market. By the time a pound of black pepper reached London or Paris, it was incredibly expensive. There were times when pepper was literally worth its weight in gold. It was a status symbol. If you were a wealthy lord serving a banquet, you used spices to show off your immense wealth, to demonstrate that you could afford to burn money on flavor. Would you take a commodity worth more than a peasant's entire annual income and sprinkle it on a piece of rotting pork? Absolutely not. If you could afford spices, you could certainly afford fresh meat. And if you were a peasant who couldn't afford fresh meat, you definitely couldn't afford the spices to mask the taste of bad meat. So, let's bury this myth. Medieval people, regardless of their class, did not eat rotten meat. They knew that rotting meat killed you. They understood food poisoning, even if they called it a flux or a fever of the stomach. So, if they didn't have refrigerators, and they didn't eat rotten meat, how did they preserve protein? The answer lies in two ancient technologies that defined the taste of the Middle Ages: salt and smoke. For the medieval peasant, fresh meat was a rare luxury, usually reserved for a very specific time of year. The rest of the year, they ate preserved meat. But when we say preserved, do not think of the delicate slices of prosciutto you buy at a deli. We are talking about industrial-level preservation designed for survival, not flavor. The process began with salt. Salt was the refrigerator of the ancient world. It draws moisture out of cells, creating an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. If a peasant slaughtered a pig, the cuts of meat would be packed in barrels of salt or rubbed heavily with it until they were essentially mummified. This meat became rock hard. It was dry, tough, and incredibly salty. Before you could even think about cooking it, you had to soak it in fresh water for hours, sometimes days, just to make it edible and to draw the salt back out. Then there was smoking. Every peasant cottage had a hearth, an open fire in the center of the room or against a wall. Above that fire, in the rafters where the smoke gathered, hung the family's fortune. Flitches of bacon, hams, and sausages dangled in the acrid wood smoke for weeks. The smoke dried the meat and coated it in chemical compounds that prevented spoilage and deterred flies. This wasn't a light, hickory-smoked flavor profile. This was intense, heavy smoking that turned meat into leather-like slabs that could last through the winter, the spring, and into the next summer. But what kind of meat were they preserving? This brings us to the animal that was the absolute hero of the medieval peasantry: the pig. If you travel back to a medieval village, you won't see many cows grazing in the peasant's backyard. Cows are large, expensive, and require high-quality pasture, which was scarce. But pigs? Pigs are miraculous. A pig is a garbage disposal unit that converts waste into protein. Peasants could let their pigs roam semi-wild in the forests, rooting for acorns, beech mast, roots, and tubers. This practice, known as pannage, was a crucial right often granted to peasants by their lords. The pig required almost no investment. It ate trash, it ate scraps, it ate things humans couldn't digest, and it grew fat. And when the time came to slaughter a pig, usually as winter approached, it offered a return on investment that no other animal could match. Everything but the squeal is a modern phrase, but it was a medieval reality. The blood was drained to make black pudding. The intestines were cleaned to make casings for sausages. The fat was rendered into lard, which was the primary cooking oil for the poor, since butter was sold and olive oil was for the rich in the South. The trotters, the ears, the snout, and the tail, everything went into the pot. In contrast, beef was a rarity on the peasant table. A cow was simply too valuable to eat. In the Middle Ages, a cow was a tractor. An ox was a machine of labor used to pull the heavy wooden plows through the clay soil. You do not eat your tractor unless it is broken or too old to work. Beef was the meat of the wealthy, or it was the meat of the desperate, eaten only when an animal died of old age or injury. By that time, The meat was tough, stringy, and required hours of boiling to be chewable. What about chicken? Surely they ate chicken. Yes, but again, economics dictated the menu. A hen lays eggs. Eggs were a vital source of daily protein, a renewable resource that you didn't have to kill to enjoy. Killing a laying hen was short-sighted. You only ate a chicken if it was a rooster, and you only needed one of those, or if the hen was too old to lay eggs. Consequently, the roasted chicken of a peasant meal was likely a tough, old bird that had to be stewed for half a day, not the tender fryer chickens we are used to. There was, however, one time of year when the rules changed. One moment in the calendar when the peasantry feasted on fresh meat in an orgy of blood and fire. This was Martinmas, the feast of Saint Martin, falling on November 11th. This period was known as the Blood Month. As winter approached, the grass stopped growing. A peasant family could only store enough hay and fodder to keep their most valuable breeding animals alive through the freezing months. They simply couldn't feed the herd. So, the surplus animals had to die. November was a time of mass slaughter. The village would smell of singed hair, boiling water, and fresh blood. For a few glorious weeks, fresh meat was abundant. Offal, the liver, heart, kidneys, had to be eaten immediately as it couldn't be salted well. It was a feast of perishable goods. This was the one time of year a peasant felt truly full of rich, fatty, fresh protein. But once the feast was over, the remaining meat was salted away, the barrels were sealed, and the long winter of preserved, salty rations began. Now, there is an elephant in the room, or rather, a deer in the forest. We cannot talk about medieval meat without talking about the secret ingredient in many peasant pots: poached game. Look at the medieval landscape. The village is surrounded by dense, beautiful forests. These forests are teeming with deer, wild boar, rabbits, and pheasants. To a hungry peasant staring at a piece of salted pork for the 100th day in a row, the forest looks like a supermarket with the doors unlocked. But there was a lock, an invisible, legal lock. The king's forest was not just a collection of trees, it was a legal institution. The rights to hunt in these woods belonged exclusively to the king or the local nobility. To take a deer was not just theft, it was a crime against the crown. The penalties were terrifying. Under William the Conqueror and his successors, the forest law was draconian. Penalties for poaching could range from heavy fines, which would bankrupt a family, to blinding, mutilation, or hanging. Despite this, poaching was rampant. It was the medieval black market. A peasant might set a snare for a rabbit, a coney, under the cover of darkness. A rabbit was easy to hide. A deer was much harder. If a peasant managed to kill a deer, the entire village often became complicit. The animal had to be butchered in secret, the skin and antlers buried or destroyed to hide the evidence. A venison feast in a peasant household was a meal eaten with the curtains drawn and one eye on the door, tasting of adrenaline and fear. But rabbits? Rabbits were the battleground of the class war. Aristocrats built warrens to breed rabbits for their own tables. Peasants saw these rabbits eating their crops. It was a constant struggle. A rabbit in the garden was a pest. A rabbit in the pot was dinner. So, we have debunked the rotten meat myth. We have established that your meat was likely salty, tough pork, or perhaps an old egg-laying hen, unless you were brave enough to steal from the king. But meat, for all its value, was not the bulk of the meal. It was the garnish. It was the flavoring. The real sustainer of life, The dish that sat on the fire 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, was something else entirely. It was a dish that has no modern equivalent, a culinary concept that sounds horrifying to us, but was efficient, practical, and nutritious. Imagine a pot that is never emptied, a soup that is older than your children, a mixture that changes flavor every single day but never truly ends. In the next part, we are going to dive into the legendary pottage and the concept of the perpetual stew. We will find out what actually went into the cauldron, why vegetables were considered dangerous by upper-class doctors, and how this humble brown sludge built the civilization of Europe. Get your spoons ready. It's time for the main course. If you walked into a peasant's cottage in the year 1350, your eyes would immediately sting from the smoke. There were no chimneys in the early medieval period, just a hole in the roof, so the smoke from the central hearth hung low in the room, creating a layer of blue haze. But once your eyes adjusted and your coughing subsided, you would see it. Hanging on a hook above the fire or sitting on a tripod directly in the embers, the object that sustained European civilization for 1,000 years. The cauldron. This heavy iron or ceramic pot was the heart of the home. It was the kitchen, the stove, and the dinner plate all rolled into one. And inside that cauldron was something that defies modern culinary categorization. It wasn't quite a soup, and it wasn't quite a stew. It was pottage. Pottage was the universal fuel of the peasantry. But to understand pottage, you have to understand a concept that sounds absolutely terrifying to the modern germ-conscious mind: the perpetual stew. Imagine a pot of food that is never fully emptied. You wake up in the morning, light the fire, and the cauldron begins to bubble. You eat from it. Then, throughout the day, you throw in whatever you have found. A handful of oats? Throw it in. A turnip you pulled from the garden? Chop it up and throw it in. A rabbit you snared? In it goes. A few leaves of cabbage? Why not? You simmer this mixture all day long. In the evening, the family eats again. But they don't scrape the pot clean. They leave the dregs, the thick sludge at the bottom. The next morning, you add water or ale to those dregs, stoke the fire, and start the process all over again. In theory, and often in practice, a single pot of stew could be kept going for weeks, months, or, if legends are to be believed, even years. The flavor profile would shift and morph over time. One week it might be rich with pork fat, the next week lean and watery with nothing but cabbage. It was a culinary timeline of the family's fortunes. Now, before you gag, there is a scientific reason this didn't kill everyone. The key is the heat. By keeping the pot simmering over the fire for hours every day, the peasant was constantly pasteurizing their food. They were killing the bacteria that would otherwise have turned this mixture into a biological weapon. It was, inadvertently, one of the safest ways to eat in a world without refrigeration. But what exactly was in this gray-brown sludge? If the foundation of the diet was grain, the body of the diet was vegetables. But here, we run into a fascinating cultural wall. Today, we are told to eat our greens. Salad is the food of the health-conscious elite. Kale is a superfood. In the Middle Ages, the script was flipped entirely. Vegetables were viewed with deep suspicion by the upper classes. This belief stemmed from the great chain of being, a philosophical and religious hierarchy that ordered the universe. God was at the top, followed by angels, humans, animals, and plants. But even within plants, there was a hierarchy. Fruit grew high on trees, closer to the heavens and the air. Therefore, fruit was noble. It was fit for aristocrats. Vegetables, especially root vegetables, grew in the dirt. They grew underground, closer to hell. Therefore, they were base foods. Medieval doctors, following the ancient theory of the four humors, believed that eating too many vegetables would depress the spirit and cause wind and melancholy. They literally believed that eating turnips would make you sad. So, the rich avoided them. A nobleman's banquet table might be piled high with roasted meats, swans, and peacocks, but you would struggle to find a single carrot. For the peasant, however, this medical advice was irrelevant. They didn't have the luxury of food philosophy. They had hunger. And the garden was their lifeline. The peasant garden, or toft, was a marvel of intensive agriculture. The undisputed king of this garden was the humble bean and the pea. We cannot overstate how important dried beans and peas were. We call them legumes. They called them poor man's meat. When the salted pork ran out in February and the chickens stopped laying eggs because of the cold, dried peas were the only thing standing between the peasant and protein deficiency. They were shelf-stable, filling, and could be boiled down into a thick, mortar-like paste that stuck to your ribs. This is the origin of the nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That wasn't a joke. That was a menu. Then there were the root vegetables, onions, garlic, and leeks. These were the flavor bombs of the medieval world. Without expensive spices like pepper, the peasant relied on the sharp, pungent bite of garlic and onion to make their bland grain pottage taste like something. The upper classes despised the smell of garlic and onions on the breath. It was the smell of the poor. But for the peasant, these bulbs were medicinal, flavorful, and vital. You would also find cabbages, parsnips, and turnips. But one thing you wouldn't see is the bright orange carrot. The orange carrot is a Dutch invention from the 17th century. Medieval carrots were purple, white, or spindly yellow things that tasted woody and earthier than the sweet sticks we eat today. And potatoes? Forget about them. The potato was still happily growing in the Andes Mountains of South America, waiting for Columbus. A medieval stew had no potatoes to thicken it. It relied on breadcrumbs or oats for texture. This pottage wasn't just food, it was a seasonal calendar. In the spring, it was green pottage, filled with fresh leafy herbs, nettles, dandelion greens, and spinach. It was vibrant and vitamin-rich, a cure for the scurvy that often set in during winter. In the autumn, it was rich with harvest vegetables and perhaps some fresh meat. But in the winter, it became white pottage or gray pottage, a bland mixture of old onions, dried peas, and pale leeks. But what happened when the garden failed? What happened when the granary was empty? This brings us to the darkest chapter of the pottage pot, famine foods. When the crops failed, which they did with terrifying regularity due to war, bad weather, or pests, the pottage changed. It ceased to be a meal and became a desperate experiment in biology. Peasants would forage for anything to fill the void in their stomachs. They would gather acorns from the forest floor. Acorns are edible, but they are full of tannins that make them incredibly bitter and toxic in large amounts. They have to be leached in water for days to be safe. Peasant women would grind these leached acorns into a coarse flour to stretch the pottage. They stripped bark from trees. They dug up roots of ferns. In the worst times, during the Great Famine of 1315, chronicles tell us of peasants eating grass like cattle, trying to extract any nutrient from the cellulose. The pottage pot, usually a symbol of comfort, became a symbol of despair. A watery broth with a few floating leaves of nettle and a handful of dirt-tasting acorn flour. But let's step back from the brink of starvation and return to a good year. Despite the lack of variety, and despite the upper class sneering at root eaters, the peasant diet was, ironically, often healthier than the noble diet. The noble suffered from gout, from heart disease, from scurvy, and from constipation caused by a diet of purely meat and refined bread. The peasant, with their pot full of fiber-rich vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, had excellent digestion. If they survived childhood, and if they didn't die of plague or famine, a peasant's body was often strong, lean, and resilient. The filthy pottage was actually a superfood bowl. There was, however, one authority that could tell you exactly what you could and could not put in that pot. An authority more powerful than the king and far more terrifying than the local lord. The church. The medieval calendar was a minefield of dietary restrictions. We tend to think of diets as a modern invention, keto, paleo, vegan. But the medieval peasant lived under the strictest diet plan in history. For nearly half the days of the year, eating meat was a mortal sin. You could be fined, you could be shamed, and you could be condemned to hellfire for eating a sausage on a Friday. So, how did they survive these fast days? Did they just eat vegetables? No. Human ingenuity is boundless when it comes to finding loopholes. In the next part, we are going to explore holy hunger. We will look at how the definition of fish was stretched to include some very suspicious animals. Beaver tails, anyone? And how the church's control over the menu inadvertently created the fishing industry that would eventually fuel the exploration of the New World. Put down your spoon and pick up your fishing rod. We are going to see what counts as fish in the eyes of. Imagine a diet plan enforced not by a doctor, a nutritionist, or a personal trainer, but by the threat of eternal damnation. Imagine a world where eating a sausage on a Friday wasn't just a slip-up. It was a mortal sin that could send your soul to the fires of hell. This was the reality for the medieval peasant. We have talked about the grain, the ale, and the pottage, but we cannot understand the medieval stomach without understanding the medieval soul. The Catholic Church was not just a place you went to on Sundays. It was the government, the clock, and the rule-book for daily life. And nowhere was its power felt more strongly than at the dinner table. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time of unbridled gluttony for the rich and starvation for the poor. But the reality was strictly regulated. For roughly 150 days a year, that is, nearly half the year, eating meat was strictly forbidden. These were the fast days, or lean days. They included every Friday in memory of the crucifixion, often every Saturday in honor of the Virgin Mary, the 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter, the weeks of Advent before Christmas, and the eves of important saints' days. On these days, the consumption of warm-blooded land animals, beef, pork, mutton, and poultry, was illegal in the eyes of God. So, did the medieval peasants starve for half the year? No, they got creative. And when I say creative, I mean they bent the laws of biology to fit the laws of theology. The church's rule was specific. You could not eat flesh. But what constituted flesh was open to interpretation. The general consensus was that animals that walked on land and had hot blood were forbidden because they inflamed the passions and made men lustful. But creatures that lived in the water, creatures that were cold and aquatic, they were fair game. This brings us to the rise of the herring. If grain was the king of the field, the herring was the king of the sea. For the medieval peasant, the Atlantic herring was the fuel that powered the fast days. But fresh fish was a luxury. Fish spoils faster than meat, and unless you lived directly on the coast, you weren't eating fresh catch. you were eating salted herring. Millions of herring were caught in the North Sea, gutted, salted, and packed into barrels. By the time they reached a peasant's table in inland Europe, they were stiff, dry, and incredibly salty. They were often called red herrings because the curing process turned the flesh a reddish brown. To eat them, you had to soak them in water for hours to draw out the salt, and even then, they were tough and fishy. Imagine eating salty, dried fish every Friday, every Saturday, and for 40 straight days during Lent. It was a test of endurance. It was so monotonous that there were recorded riots and complaints from students and laborers who threatened to strike if they were served one more red herring. But for the wealthy and the clever, the definition of fish became a playground of theological loopholes. The medieval understanding of biology was flexible. They classified animals not by their DNA, but by their habitat. If it swam, it was a fish. This logic led to one of the most bizarre culinary classifications in history: the beaver. The beaver is clearly a mammal. It has fur, it has warm blood, and it builds dams. But, medieval scholars argued, look at its tail. It is scaly. It looks like a fish. And the beaver spends most of its time in the water. Therefore, the church decreed that the beaver's tail, and by extension, its hindquarters, counted as fish. So, on a Holy Friday, a wealthy noble could sit down to a roast dinner of beaver tail. It was rich, fatty, and technically, perfectly pious. But it gets weirder. Let me introduce you to the barnacle goose. This is a type of small goose that migrates to Europe in the winter. Medieval people never saw these geese nesting or laying eggs because they bred in the remote Arctic, far beyond the reach of European travelers. All they knew was that these geese appeared on the coasts at the same time that driftwood washed up covered in goose barnacles. The barnacles, with their long stalks, looked vaguely like the necks of tiny birds. So, a theory developed. The geese didn't hatch from eggs like normal birds. They grew on trees that hung over the water, or they spontaneously generated from rotting driftwood. Since they were not born of meat, since they were essentially fruit of the sea, eating them was not eating meat. For centuries, you could eat roast goose during Lent, provided you claimed it was a barnacle goose. It was a divine loophole that allowed the wealthy to feast while the poor gnawed on their salted herring. But fasting wasn't just about meat. During the strictest periods like Lent, lacticinia were also forbidden. This meant no dairy, no milk, no cheese, no butter, and no eggs. For the peasant, this was a disaster. Cheese and eggs were their primary source of protein when meat was unavailable. To take them away was to strip the diet of its richness. They were forced to cook with oil, which was expensive and rare in the north, or simply boil their food in water. However, the upper classes found a workaround for this too. They became obsessed with almond milk. We tend to think of almond milk as a modern, trendy, vegan coffee creamer. In reality, it was a medieval staple for the rich. Almonds could be ground up and mixed with water to create a creamy white liquid that looked like cow's milk but was plant-based. It was legal during Lent. Medieval cookbooks are full of recipes using almond milk to make rich, creamy sauces, custards, and soups that mimicked the forbidden dairy dishes. If you were a lord, Lent was just a culinary challenge, a time to show off your chef's ability to turn nuts into cream and fruit into fish. If you were a peasant, Lent was a time of gray gruel, hard bread, and fish that tasted like a salt lick. This religious control of food had a massive economic impact. It drove the exploration of the oceans. The desperate need for fish to feed a fasting Europe pushed fishermen further and further into the Atlantic. It is no coincidence that the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, were likely visited by Basque and Bristol fishermen searching for cod long before Columbus discovered the Americas. They were chasing the Lent money. But let's strip away the funny stories about beaver tails and the economics of herring. Underneath all of this was a profound psychological reality. The medieval peasant lived in a world where their hunger was not just physical, it was spiritual. When they sat down to a meager meal of bread and watery ale on a Friday, they believed they were doing something important. They were suffering a little bit to save their souls. They were participating in a cosmic drama where their stomach growls were a prayer. However, there is a difference between fasting by choice or by law and starving by necessity. The peasant could endure Lent because they knew that Easter was coming. They knew that on Easter Sunday the pig would be roasted, the eggs would be eaten, and the feast would return. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. But what happens when the light goes out? What happens when the fasting isn't on the calendar? What happens when the rain starts falling in June and doesn't stop? When the wheat turns black in the field? When the pottage pot is empty, not because of God's law, but because nature has turned against you? The medieval food system was a house of cards. It relied on a delicate balance of weather, labor, and luck. And periodically, that house of cards collapsed. In the final part of our journey, we are going to face the ultimate horror of the medieval peasant. Not the king, not the church, not the rotten meat, but the famine. We will look at what happens when the bread runs out, and we will uncover the terrifying truth of St. Anthony's fire, a hallucination-inducing disease caused by the very food meant to keep them alive. We have talked about how they lived. Now we must talk about how they died. The feast is over. The famine begins. The year is 1315. It is spring. You are a peasant in northern Europe. You have survived the winter on salted pork, dried peas, and hard bread. You are looking forward to the sun, to the harvest, to the return of plenty. But the sun does not come. Instead, the rain comes, and it does not stop. Chronicles from the time describe a deluge of biblical proportions. The sky turned gray and opened up for months. The fields, plowed and planted with the precious grain that was supposed to feed your family for the next year, turned into swamps. The wheat rotted in the ground before it could even sprout. The hay, needed to feed the animals, turned to mush. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It was a catastrophe that would kill millions and reshape the European psyche. And it reveals the terrifying fragility of the medieval diet we have been exploring. When the grain failed, the entire system collapsed. Remember, 80% of your calories came from bread and ale. Take that away, and there is no backup plan. There is no supermarket to import food from another continent. There is only the empty barn. First, the price of grain skyrocketed. Only the rich could afford bread. The peasants stopped making ale because they couldn't waste the barley. They needed to eat it. So the safe, calorie-rich drink vanished, replaced by dirty water. Dysentery spread like wildfire. Then, the animals began to die. Sheep and cattle, standing in waterlogged fields with no dry fodder, succumbed to disease. But the starving peasants ate them anyway. They ate the animals that died of murrain and rot. They ate the dogs that guarded the sheep. They ate the cats that caught the rats. And then, When there were no cats left, they ate the rats. The chronicles of the time turn into horror stories. They speak of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed. They speak of thieves imprisoned for stealing food, devouring each other in the dungeons. There are even whispers, dark, unverified, but persistent whispers, of graves being disturbed. But famine wasn't the only horror hiding in the food supply. Sometimes the grain didn't just fail. Sometimes it betrayed you. Let's talk about the nightmare I mentioned at the very beginning of this series, the Black Death of the Limbs. St. Anthony's Fire. This is one of the most terrifying medical phenomena in history, and it came directly from the peasants' daily bread. It was caused by a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, or ergot. Ergot loves damp, cool weather, the kind you get in a bad summer. It infects rye, the primary grain of the poor. When ergot grows on rye, it replaces the healthy grain with a dark, purplish-black sclerotium. To a hungry peasant harvesting quickly in the twilight, these black spurs look just like a slightly larger grain of rye. They get thrown into the sack. They get taken to the mill. They get ground into the flour. When you bake that flour into bread, you are essentially baking a chemical weapon. Ergot contains alkaloids that are the precursor to LSD. But unlike a recreational trip, ergot poisoning is a slow, agonizing descent into hell. The symptoms usually started with a tingling in the fingers and toes. Then, the burning sensation began. It felt like your limbs were on fire, hence the name St. Anthony's Fire. The alkaloids caused extreme vasoconstriction, shutting off the blood supply to your extremities. Slowly, your fingers, your toes, your hands, and your feet would turn black. They would shrivel up and die. Gangrene would set in, and in the final, horrific stages, the dead limbs would simply break off. People would walk into hospitals carrying their own feet, but that was only the physical horror. The psychological effects were just as bad. The victims would hallucinate. They saw demons. They saw the devil coming to take them. They felt invisible insects crawling under their skin. In a deeply religious world, this wasn't seen as a fungal infection. It was seen as divine punishment, or worse, witchcraft. How many women were accused of being witches because their neighbors started seeing demons and screaming about invisible fires? How many possessed people were actually just suffering from bad bread? We will never know the true number, but historians suspect that outbreaks of ergotism fueled waves of mass hysteria and witch trials throughout the Middle Ages. The irony is heartbreaking. The peasant, starving and desperate, would pray for bread, and when they finally got it, the bread ate them alive. So, where does this leave us? We have traveled from the muddy fields to the smoke-filled taverns, from the strict laws of the church to the desperate measures of the famine. We have debunked the myth of the rotten meat. We know now that medieval people were not stupid. They did not cover putrid flesh with expensive spices. They were masters of preservation, using salt and smoke to conquer the seasons. They were ingenious scavengers, turning the garbage parts of a pig into nutrient-dense sausages and pottage. We have learned that their diet, while monotonous and precarious, was not the nutritional wasteland we often imagine. In good years, a peasant eating whole-grain maslin bread, a vegetable-packed pottage, and drinking nutrient-rich ale was likely getting more fiber, fewer chemicals, and less sugar than the average modern American. They had great teeth, if they didn't grind them down on stones, and strong bodies, if they survived childhood. The filthy truth about medieval food isn't that it was dirty or disgusting, it's that it was hard. Every meal was a victory. Every loaf of bread represented a year of back-breaking labor, of plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, milling, and baking. Every piece of bacon was a pig raised, defended from wolves, and slaughtered with reverence. Every cup of ale was a hedge against dirty water, and a source of comfort in a cold world. We look back at them with pity, imagining them suffering through their gross food. But perhaps we should look at them with respect. They survived a world without safety nets. They built the cathedrals, fought the wars, and laid the foundations of the modern world, all fueled by pottage and determination. They were the survivors, and their blood runs in our veins. So, the next time you go to the supermarket and see aisles overflowing with food from every corner of the globe, the next time you throw away a piece of bread just because the crust is a little dry, pause for a second. Remember the peasant, remember the pottage, and remember that for most of human history, a full stomach was the greatest luxury of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope you will never look at a loaf of rye bread the same way again. If you survived this 6-part deep dive, you are officially a member of the inner circle. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button. It tells YouTube that history matters. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next documentary.